Tommy Wilson stood in the rain outside his grandfather's farmhouse, holding only a rope attached to a small pink pig. At 12 years old, he was now completely alone. His mother had passed away years ago, and now his grandfather, his only family, left, was gone too. The social worker stood by her car looking at her watch repeatedly. "I'm sorry, Tommy, but we need to go now. The new family is waiting," she said, walking towards him with an umbrella. But Tommy couldn't move. This farm had been his whole life. The memories of helping his grandfather feed the animals every morning, the smell of fresh hay, and the sound of his grandfather's laugh. It was all he had left. "What about Dorothy?" Tommy asked, looking down at the pig who was contentedly munching on some grass. "The Hendersons don't allow pets," the social worker replied. "We'll have to take her to the animal shelter." Tommy's heart sank. Dorothy wasn't just a pet. She was the last gift his grandfather had given him. Just 2 weeks before passing away, his grandfather had handed him the tiny piglet with a mysterious smile. "This pig is special, Tommy," his grandfather had said, his voice weak, but his eyes twinkling. "Take good care of her and she'll take care of you. Remember, sometimes the greatest treasures come in unexpected packages." The lawyer handling his grandfather's estate had laughed when he read the will. The old farmhouse and land had to be sold to pay off debts, but Tommy's only inheritance was officially listed as one female pig referred to as Dorothy. The lawyer had called it worthless, but Tommy knew better. His grandfather never did anything without a reason. "Please, Tommy," begged the social worker. "Dorothy is all I have left. I promise I'll take care of her myself. You won't have to do anything." Mrs. Johnson, the social worker, looked at the boy's pleading face and then at the pig. She'd been doing this job for 20 years, and she knew the pain of losing everything. Maybe she could bend the rules just this once. "I'll talk to the Hendersons," she said with a sigh. "But you have to promise to keep her in their backyard and clean up after her." Tommy hugged Dorothy, who oinked happily. The Hendersons lived in a nice house at the edge of town. Mr. Henderson was a successful businessman who owned several car dealerships in the area. His wife spent most of her time organizing charity events and garden parties. They had no children of their own and had agreed to foster Tommy, mostly because it would look good for their social standing. When Tommy arrived at their house with Dorothy in tow, Mrs. Henderson's face turned white with horror. "A pig? In my garden?" she shrieked. "Absolutely not. What will the neighbors think?" But Mr. Henderson saw an opportunity. He'd been trying to get on the good side of William Parker, the richest man in town who happened to love animals and owned a huge agricultural company. "Now, dear," he said smoothly, "think of how charitable we'll look, taking in both an orphan and his beloved pet. We could even mention it at the next fundraiser." And so Dorothy was allowed to stay, though she was confined to a small pen at the very back of the property, hidden behind tall hedges. Tommy spent every free moment with her, talking to her about his day, his fears, and how much he missed his grandfather. What nobody knew was that Dorothy was indeed special, but not in any way they could have imagined. Every morning, Tommy would clean her pen and notice something odd in the mud, something that would soon change everything. The first time he found it, he thought it was just a piece of glass catching the sunlight. But when he picked it up, his eyes widened. It was a gold coin, old and valuable. The next day he found another and then another. Tommy remembered his grandfather's last words about Dorothy being special and treasures coming in unexpected packages. Somehow Dorothy was finding these coins, rooting them up from deep in the earth. But where were they coming from, and how many more were there? He kept the discovery a secret, carefully cleaning each coin and storing them in a shoebox under his bed. The Hendersons never bothered to check on Dorothy, so nobody noticed anything unusual. But as his collection grew, Tommy began to form a plan. During the day, he went to school and pretended to be the quiet, sad orphan everyone expected him to be, but his mind was always working, thinking about the future. He started reading books about coin collecting and rare antiquities. He learned that some of the coins Dorothy was finding were extremely rare, dating back over 100 years. One evening, as Tommy sat doing his homework at the kitchen table, he overheard Mr. Henderson talking on the phone. "Yes, the boy's grandfather's farm," Mr. Henderson was saying. "The bank's selling it dirt cheap because of the debts. Once we buy it and clear the land, we can build that shopping center we've been planning. The profit margins will be incredible. Tommy's heart started racing. They were going to destroy his grandfather's farm. But what if there were more coins buried there? What if his grandfather had known about them all along, and that's why he gave him Dorothy? Looking out the window at Dorothy's pen, Tommy saw her happily rooting in the mud, and a determined smile spread across his face. His grandfather had given him more than just a pig. He'd given him a chance to save everything that mattered. But time was running out. The Hendersons were already making plans to buy the farm, and Tommy was just a 12-year-old boy with a pig. What he didn't know was that his story was about to capture the imagination of the entire town, and that Dorothy the pig would become the talk of every coffee shop and dinner table for miles around. The next morning, Tommy woke up early and went straight to Dorothy's pen. The pig greeted him with a happy grunt, already digging in her favorite spot. Tommy watched in amazement as her snout pushed aside some dirt, revealing another gleaming coin. "Good girl," he whispered, quickly picking it up and putting it in his pocket. He needed to find someone who could help him sell these coins without asking too many questions, but who would take a 12-year-old boy seriously. That's when he remembered old Mr. Jenkins, who owned the antique shop downtown. His grandfather used to take him there sometimes, and Mr. Jenkins had always been kind to him. After school that day, Tommy wrapped 3 of his best coins in a handkerchief and walked to the shop. The bell above the door jingled as Tommy entered. Mr. Jenkins was helping a customer, so Tommy looked around at all the old treasures filling the shelves, photos, furniture, watches, and yes, coins. There was even a display case full of them. "Well, if it isn't young Tommy Wilson," Mr. Jenkins said after the customer left. "I was so sorry to hear about your grandfather. He was a good man." Tommy pulled out the handkerchief with shaking hands. "Mr. Jenkins, I was wondering if you could tell me what these are worth." The old man's eyes widened as he examined the coins through his magnifying glass. "Where did you get these, son?" "They were my grandfather's," Tommy said. It wasn't exactly a lie. "There are more, but I wanted to check if they're worth anything first." Mr. Jenkins sat down heavily in his chair. "Worth anything?" "Tommy, these are rare Liberty Head gold coins from the 1800s. Each one is worth thousands of dollars." Tommy's heart started pounding. Thousands of dollars. He had over 30 coins in his shoebox already. "I can help you sell them," Mr. Jenkins offered. "But we need to do this properly through official channels. Does your foster family know about these?" Tommy shook his head quickly. "Please don't tell them. They're already planning to buy my grandfather's farm and tear it down. If they know about the coins..." Mr. Jenkins understood immediately. He'd known Tommy's grandfather well enough to know there must be more to this story. "Tell me everything," he said, flipping the open sign to closed and making them both hot chocolate. Tommy told him about Dorothy, about how his grandfather had given her to him just before dying, and about the coins she kept finding. Mr. Jenkins listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding thoughtfully. "Your grandfather was a clever man," he said finally. "You see, there's an old story about a gold shipment that went missing around here during the Civil War. Some say the coins were buried somewhere in this area, but no one ever found them. Your grandfather must have known something about it." "But why didn't he dig them up himself?" Tommy asked. Mr. Jenkins smiled. "Maybe he wanted you to find them. Maybe this was his way of making sure you'd be taken care of." They made a plan. Mr. Jenkins would help Tommy sell the coins slowly, a few at a time to avoid raising suspicion. He would also keep track of the Hendersons' plans for the farm. Meanwhile, Dorothy kept finding more coins. Tommy started marking their locations on an old map of the property. A pattern was emerging. All the coins seemed to be coming from along what used to be an old wagon trail, but the Hendersons were moving faster than expected. One evening, Tommy overheard Mrs. Henderson on the phone with her friends. "Yes, we're buying that old Wilson farm next week," she said proudly. "Richard has all the permits ready. We'll start clearing the land immediately for the shopping center. It's going to be magnificent. Upscale boutiques, a spa, maybe even a small theater." Tommy ran to Mr. Jenkins the next day. "We're running out of time. They're buying the farm next week." The old man thought for a moment. "Tommy, how many coins have you found so far?" 47, Tommy said. And Mr. Jenkins, they're not just random coins anymore. The ones Dorothy found yesterday had markings on them, like they were part of something bigger. Mr. Jenkins examined the newest coins carefully. His face grew serious. These markings, they're military. These coins were definitely part of that lost Civil War shipment. This isn't just about saving your grandfather's farm anymore, Tommy. This is a historical treasure. But as they were talking, neither of them noticed Mrs. Henderson walking past the shop window. She stopped when she saw Tommy inside, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Why was the boy spending so much time at an antique shop? That night at dinner, she watched Tommy carefully. "How was your day, Tommy? Did you do anything interesting after school?" "Just homework," Tommy said quickly, too quickly. Mrs. Henderson smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The next day, while Tommy was at school, she went through his room. Under the bed, she found the shoebox full of coins. Her scream of surprise brought Mr. Henderson running upstairs. Together, they stared at the small fortune in gold coins. Where did he get these? Mr. Henderson wondered aloud. Then his eyes widened with realization. The farm! There must be more on the farm. Mrs. Henderson grabbed his arm excitedly. "We have to speed up the purchase. Call the bank right now." But as they rushed to put their plan into action, they didn't realize that their gardener had overheard everything through the open window. And the gardener's daughter happened to be Tommy's best friend at school. Lucy Martinez ran all the way to school the next morning to find Tommy. Her father had told her everything he overheard at the Hendersons' house. She caught up with Tommy just before the first bell. "Tommy, the Hendersons found your coins," she said, trying to catch her breath. "They went through your room while you were at school yesterday." Tommy felt like the ground had disappeared under his feet. All those coins, all his plans to save the farm, gone. He ran out of school, ignoring the teachers calling after him. He had to get to Dorothy. But when he reached the Hendersons' house, Dorothy's pen was empty. The gate was open, and his pig was nowhere to be seen. Panic rose in his chest as he heard Mrs. Henderson's voice from inside the house. "The animal control people will be here any minute to pick up that filthy pig," she was saying, "and Richard is at the bank right now, finalizing the farm purchase. Everything's falling into place perfectly." Tommy ran to Mr. Jenkins's shop, tears streaming down his face. The old man took one look at him and knew something was wrong. "They took Dorothy," Tommy cried, "and they found the coins. They're buying the farm today." Mr. Jenkins grabbed his coat. "Not if we can help it. I made some calls last night after you left. There's someone you need to meet." They drove to a big office building downtown. The sign on the door read, "William Parker, Agricultural Enterprises." Tommy had heard of Mr. Parker. Everyone had. He was the richest man in town and owned most of the farming businesses in the county. Mr. Parker was a tall man with kind eyes and rough hands that showed he wasn't afraid of hard work. He listened carefully as Tommy told his story about his grandfather, Dorothy, the coins, and the Hendersons' plans. "Your grandfather was a good friend of mine," Mr. Parker said when Tommy finished. "He came to me a few months before he died and told me about those coins. He'd found one while plowing his field years ago and figured out there must be more. But he wanted you to be the one to find them." "But why?" Tommy asked. "Because he knew you'd use the money wisely. He wanted you to learn the value of hard work and honesty. That's why he gave you Dorothy. She's a special breed of pig, trained to find metals in the ground. They use them in Europe to find truffles, but your grandfather trained her to find gold." Just then, Mr. Jenkins's phone rang. It was Lucy. "The animal control truck just left the Hendersons' house with Dorothy," she reported. "They're taking her to the shelter on Oak Street." Mr. Parker stood up. "Let's go get your pig back, son, and then we'll deal with the Hendersons." They raced to the animal shelter, where they found Dorothy in a cage, looking very unhappy. Mr. Parker flashed his ID and explained the situation to the shelter manager. "This pig is part of a historical research project," he said firmly. "She was taken without the owner's permission." Meanwhile, at the bank, Mr. Henderson was about to sign the final papers for the farm purchase when his phone rang. It was his lawyer. "Don't sign anything," the lawyer warned. "The Historical Society just filed an emergency petition. They're claiming the Wilson farm might be the site of a significant Civil War artifact discovery. All development plans are suspended pending an investigation." Mr. Henderson's face turned red with anger. He slammed down the phone and rushed back home, only to find his wife in hysterics. "The media is outside," she cried. "Someone tipped them off about the coins. They're saying we stole from an orphan. Our reputation will be ruined." News cameras filmed as Tommy walked up the Hendersons' driveway with Dorothy on a leash, accompanied by Mr. Parker and Mr. Jenkins. Behind them came police officers with a search warrant. "We have reason to believe you're in possession of stolen historical artifacts," one officer said to the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson tried to maintain her dignity. "Those coins belong to us now. We're the boy's legal guardians, and anything he finds is legally ours." Actually, Mr. Parker stepped forward. "According to Tommy's grandfather's will, the pig belongs solely to Tommy. And since the pig found the coins, they legally belong to Tommy as well." The Hendersons watched in horror as the police recovered all the coins from their bedroom safe. Reporters took pictures as Tommy was reunited with his collection, but the biggest surprise came when Mr. Parker made an announcement right there on the Hendersons' front lawn, with all the news cameras rolling. "I'm offering to buy the Wilson farm from the bank," he declared. "Not to tear it down, but to turn it into a